If you've been putting off your second passport or second residency because you figure you'll get to it eventually, this video is specifically for you. Because the world's richest man in the fashion industry had the same plan. And when the time finally came, all the money in the world could not save him. And I do mean all the money in the world. Today's subject is Bernard Arnault, the chairman and CEO of LVMH. That's Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, Moët Hennessy, Bulgari, Givenchy, and about 70 other brands that you've heard of and probably seen on the runway. At the end of 2025, his net worth sits at approximately $190 billion, making him one of the two or three richest people on the planet. He has access to the finest legal minds in Europe and the world. He has more financial resources than more countries, and he's had decades to think about what he wants to do. But when the pressure came, he panicked. He moved too fast and he got it badly wrong, and it played out on the front page of every newspaper in France. Three lessons are buried in this story. The third one is the one that nobody talks about, and it's the one that's most directly relevant to where you are sitting right now. I'm Brad with Evolution Expats. What we do here is we cut through the noise on second citizenship, international residency, and what it actually takes to build a life that isn't at the mercy of any one government's bad idea. And today, we're going to do what this channel does best. We're learning from someone else's expensive mistakes so we don't have to make our own. So let's go back to 2012 in France. President François Hollande has just been elected on a platform that includes a 75% tax rate on personal incomes over 1 million euros. Not a typo, 75%. The math on that is simple. If you earn 10 million euros, you hand 7.5 million to the French government and get to keep the rest. Now, for a man with a fortune approaching $40 billion at the time, and it was climbing fast, this was not an abstract policy debate. This was a direct and significant threat to how much of his wealth he would be able to retain, to pass on to his children, and use to protect the business empire he had spent his entire adult life building. So, Bernard Arnault did what anyone facing a massive tax threat might consider doing. He applied for citizenship in Belgium. Now, Belgium sits right next door to France, and he did already have a home in Brussels. He had some genuine business ties there. The LVMH company had holding structures in Belgium going back years. He had what seemed on paper like a reasonable argument, so he filed the application. And within 24 hours, France exploded. The left-leaning newspaper Liberation put his face on the front cover under the headline, and I'll give you the polite translation, "Get lost, rich idiot." The far-left politician Jean-Luc Mélenchon called him a parasite. The socialist government accused him of lacking patriotism at a moment of economic crisis. Both the far left and the far right piled on simultaneously, which is a rare achievement unifying French politics in this way. President Hollande went on national television and said Arnault should have measured what it means to apply for citizenship to another country before he did it. Now, Arnault fought back. He gave interviews insisting he was not fleeing the tax man. He said his motivation was purely about protecting his family foundation, a legal structure that he had set up in Belgium to ensure that his children couldn't break up the company LVMH if he died unexpectedly. And he said that France was simply unavailable for that because it didn't have the same legal framework available. He sued the Liberation newspaper for the headline. He said repeatedly that he would remain a tax resident of France no matter what. But nobody believed him. And the public opinion problem was only the beginning. The Belgian courts looked at his application and handed down a negative opinion. The reason? Belgian law requires applicants to prove at least 3 years of residency in Belgium. Bernard Arnault lived in Paris. He had a home in Brussels, but he hadn't been living there, so he didn't meet the requirement. In April of 2013, less than a year after he filed, he withdrew the application himself and gave an interview with Le Monde newspaper saying, and this is a paraphrase, that he had decided to end the confusion. But that was not the end. Belgian prosecutors had opened an investigation into whether he had falsely claimed Belgian residence when he filed. That investigation ran for 5 years. In 2017, a Brussels court confirmed the closure of the inquiry after Arnault agreed to pay an undisclosed sum to end the proceedings, without admitting guilt. The maximum fine for a false citizenship claim in Belgium is 3 million euros. Sources with knowledge of the case put the actual figure in the tens of thousands of euros, but that's a bit beside the point. The world's richest man in fashion spent 5 years with prosecutors looking into his citizenship application, settled a legal investigation, and ended up with exactly nothing to show for it. No Belgian citizenship, no reduction in his French taxes, just 5 years of headlines and a legal settlement. So, lesson 1 is the procrastination trap. Did Bernard Arnault know in 2012 that French taxes were going to go up? Of course he did. Hollande had been campaigning on the 75% rate for months before he was elected. The direction of travel had been clear for years. France's tax burden on high earners has been climbing since the 1980s, which, By the way, is why Arnault briefly relocated himself to the United States after the last socialist government under Mitterrand came to power in 1981. He had already seen this movie. He knew how it ended. He just didn't think it would get this bad, and he kept telling himself he'd deal with it when it became a necessity. Does that sound familiar? The Belgian citizenship process requires at minimum 3 years of established residency. That's not a rule Arnault could have bought his way around or hired his way around with the right lawyer. It's a flat requirement for everyone, which means that when he applied in September of 2012, he had already missed the window by at least 3 years. The only way he could have Belgian citizenship available to him in 2012 is if he had started no later than 2009, ideally even earlier than that. So let's cast our minds back to 1992. Bernard Arnault is a 43-year-old businessman. He has recently acquired Christian Dior and is building what will become the LVMH company. He is successful, but not yet a household name outside of the business community. The internet is essentially a university experiment. His net worth is only a fraction of what it will become. He has a genuine home and a genuine business tie in Belgium. Now, if he had quietly established Belgian residency in 1991 and spent the required time there and obtained his Belgian citizenship in 1995 or 1996, who would have cared? Nobody's writing front page stories about a mid-level French executive maintaining dual citizenship with a neighboring country. No politician would be calling him unpatriotic. No prosecutor would be looking into his residency claims. He just has the Belgian citizenship, quietly, legally, sitting there as an option going forward. And when Hollande announces the 75% Supertax in 2012, it's France's problem, not his, because he handled it 20 years ago when it was nothing that was at stake. There was no scrutiny, no time pressure, and no one was watching. That window existed, he didn't use it. And when the next window opened, under pressure, in public, in reaction to a specific political event, it was already too late. Bernard Arnault had 40 years to make that strategic choice, and he made a crisis response instead, and every single thing that went wrong afterwards flowed directly from that one mistake. Lesson 2. Move before anyone has a reason to look. Even if Arnault had somehow met the residency requirement, even if the Belgian courts had approved his application in 2012, he had already lost, because he had already made his moves in public, under pressure, in a direct response to a named piece of legislation, in one of the most watched political moments in recent French history. That sequence is the problem, not the citizenship application itself, the sequence. When you move in reaction to a crisis, you tell everyone exactly what you're doing. You hand your critics the narrative. You make your motivations undeniable, and you spend every moment of the process defending yourself against an accusation you have, through your own timing, made impossible to deny. But if he had done this 20 years earlier, none of those people would have had anything to say about it. Not one word. There's just no story there at that point. There's no news hook. There's no world richest man in fashion flees to Belgium. There's just a dual citizen who happens to run a luxury goods company, and that is entirely unremarkable at the time. No politician can score points off it. No prosecutor needs to look twice. The opinion of the entire French public about Bernard Arnault's citizenship status is completely, utterly, and permanently irrelevant because he made that decision long before anyone had reason to care. That's the goal. Not to survive the scrutiny, but to make yourself unscratchable before anyone is even looking. So ask yourself, how many windows are closing right now because you haven't noticed them yet? Lesson 3. The argument he was actually making. Now, Arnault's stated reason for wanting Belgian citizenship wasn't taxes. It was his family foundation. He had set up a private structure in Belgium called a Protect Invest, specifically designed to prevent his 5 children from selling or dividing their stakes in the LVMH company if he died unexpectedly. And his argument was that France didn't have the equivalent legal concept of a private foundation in its legal framework, so Belgian law gave him something that French law simply couldn't. The Belgian courts didn't believe him. The prosecutors didn't believe him. The French public definitely didn't believe him. Filing a citizenship application the same week that a 75% supertax is announced does not lend itself to a charitable interpretation. But his underlying argument wasn't wrong. France genuinely doesn't have that legal structure. His desire to protect his business empire through a vehicle his home country doesn't recognize is a real problem that founders with complex ownership structures face. And seeking better legal and financial environments for legitimate estate planning is not a corrupt impulse. It's a rational one with a centuries-long tradition all across of Europe. Ireland, for example, built itself into a European technology hub partly by maintaining one of the lowest corporate tax rates on the continent. Companies moved there legally. Nobody called them unpatriotic. They called them smart. The same conversation is happening in France right now in 2025 and 2026, with a proposed 2% annual wealth tax on fortunes above 100 million euros. Arnault has already publicly called it deadly for the economy. He's still fighting this battle 20 plus years later because he never built a position that would have made the battle irrelevant for him and his company. The internationalization of your financial life, a second passport, a second residency, a foreign holding structure, and estate plan across multiple jurisdictions is not something that you do in response to bad news. It's something that you build quietly, carefully, and legally over years before anyone is motivated to look at it. If Arnault had done that, his estate planning argument would have been the whole story instead of a defense that nobody believed. His Belgian citizenship would have been a footnote in his business profile on Wikipedia, not a national scandal. The plan he needed in 2012 had to be started in 1992. The plan you need, dear viewer, in 2032 needs to start now. As Bernard Arnault found out, every pathway has a clock. Citizenship by descent requires documents that take months or years to locate, translate, certify, and submit, and the laws governing the eligibility change constantly. Check out my video on how Italy erased citizenship eligibility from millions of people just last year. Naturalization requires years of actual physical presence. Residency programs that exist today may not exist tomorrow. Portugal changed its golden visa terms midstream. Programs close without notice, and the countries do not reopen the windows that they have shut. The people who are most protected right now started 3 or 4 years ago. The people who are most protected in 3 or 4 years start today. What you get from a consultation with Evolution Expats is an internationalization blueprint built around your specific situation, where you're from, what you hold, what you want to protect, what's realistic, and what your actual timeline looks like. You leave that conversation with a clear picture of your options and a real understanding of why starting now is the best way to go about it instead of starting in an emergency. Bernard Arnault had 40 years of, I'll get to it, 40 years of assuming that the window would still be there. It wasn't. Link to book is in the description. It's not something you want to worry about getting to eventually. Eventually is what got Arnault destroyed. And if you're new here and you want to see a good example of how these situations, both good and bad, play out in the real world, check my celebrity case study playlist. It's linked below. George Clooney, Rosie O'Donnell, Kabe Lame, Pope Leo XIV. Real stories, real stakes, no jargon. It's the most binge-worthy thing on my channel. Remember, the right information makes it all possible. I'm Brad with Evolution Expats. I'll see you in our next video.